Ever since I moved from the US to Italy 5 years ago, the question that I get asked the most is, what kind of visa did you get to move here? The short answer is, I didn't need a visa because I'm an Italian citizen. But if you want to know the full story of how and why I got my Italian citizenship, long before I decided to move here, then keep watching. Like many Americans, my family is not originally from the US, so I got my citizenship through descent, but I didn't know I was even eligible for citizenship until I was an adult. So the story about my family starts back in 1947. My grandmother's story is similar to a lot of other immigrants, but I think hers is pretty unique. She came over as an adult to the US and she actually came completely alone. Her family was from Sicily, and during the war, their town was occupied and the house that they lived in was actually bombed. It was decided, I guess, among the family that someone needed to get out and set up in a new country and help the rest of the family out. They had distant relatives in the US, and my grandfather was single, and so it was arranged that they would be married. So she came over by herself and didn't speak a word of English, didn't really know anyone. I guess they had written letters back and forth, but she was basically set up to marry a stranger. She was the original 90-day fiance. She had to get married or she had to go back. That must have been terrifying for her, but there was really no other option. So she did it. And luckily, my grandfather was a normal guy. He was American, but he also spoke Italian because his family was also from Sicily. My grandmother never really went back to Italy, even to visit. She only went back a few times. She pretty much started her life, learned English, got herself her own US citizenship like very quickly. It was within a few years. So my mom never knew her entire life, but she was eligible for Italian citizenship. And then later, I found out that I was too. People also ask me why I didn't grow up speaking Italian, if that's where my family is from. And the reason, this is, I think, pretty common in the US. My grandmother didn't teach her kids Italian because she wanted them to be fully integrated. And back then, it was thought that if you taught a kid two languages, they would maybe get confused or they would have a really thick accent. She wanted them to be American and blend in. She had good intentions, but because of that, my mom never really became fluent in Italian and she never was able to teach me and my sisters Italian. So I always knew my Italian side of my family. My grandmother had saved up and built a life here, and she started bringing her entire family. So all of my great aunts and uncles, my grandma's brothers and sisters. She brought all of them. She brought her parents. So I knew my great grandmother, but my great grandmother and most of my grandmother's siblings didn't speak a lot of English. And we didn't see that side of the family so much, mostly just holidays and big events. I wasn't exposed to the language enough to really learn it. And also they spoke to each other in the dialect from the town they were from in Sicily. So even when I started studying Italian, the Italian I was learning was different than what I had heard being spoken growing up. So fast forward to the late 90s, I was in college and I really started getting interested in my family history and started talking more with my grandmother, and she started telling me stories. A lot of her life was just very hard times. She was born during the times of the Depression and lived through World War II. I think she just wanted to leave it all behind and look to the future when she moved to the US. So I became interested in learning the language and I really wanted to study abroad. But at my school, it was hard to get into the study abroad program. So I actually didn't get in. So I applied for this grant that they offered to undergraduates who were doing an independent research project. So I created this project because I was studying creative writing. I wanted to write some stories about my family history. So I needed to go to Italy to complete this project. So I wrote the proposal and I got the grant, and it was not that much. I think it was like $2,500. But in 1997, that was a good amount. It was enough for me to get a plane ticket and I got my Eurail pass. So I just went. And that was the first time I ever traveled by myself. I was 20 years old. I had studied a few semesters of Italian before I left, and I was pretty confident that I could get by, which looking back, I still didn't really know much, but I did know, enough to really do the basics. Back then, there was no Google Translate, there was no maps, there was no cell phones really. Traveling was really it was so different and it was so much fun, but it really forced you really had to talk to people to figure out where you were going. You used paper maps. I had one book called Let's Go Italy. I booked my first few nights in Rome at a hostel, and that's it. I'm really glad I had that opportunity because traveling these days is so much different. It's easier in some ways and harder in some ways, I think, for younger people. It's not as easy for them to connect with each other because you can fall back on your phone. But at the same time, it's easier to find the attractions and book train tickets and things like that. I was trying to get to Sicily I wanted to see where my grandmother was born, obviously the town she was from. And oh no, was my phone getting wet? It wasn't just my first time in Italy. It was my first time traveling overseas. I didn't know if it would be my only time being in Europe. So there was so much I wanted to see and do. My rail pass was good for 5 countries because I had this idea that I was going to do some traveling in Italy, but also while I was there, I wanted to see Spain and France and Portugal. I felt like I had all the time in the world, but once I got to Italy, I felt so happy there and I felt so at home. I spent a lot of my time in Rome, which is not the typical Italian city. I've always been a city person, so I just felt really at home there. There was a lot of other travelers and people from all over the world that I met. It just opened my eyes to a whole new perspective of life and how people think about life. It was just so different from what I was used to in the US. Just Italy itself, I just felt really this strong connection, of course, because of my family. But I didn't have a long-term plan, of course, to stay there. I was there for 2 months. I had a whole year left of university and I had to finish this research project, which was why I went there in the first place. My goal was to go to Sicily and see the town that my grandmother grew up in. But I also had this fear, even though I was in Italy by myself, I had built this sort of comfort level with where I was staying in Rome and the people that I knew there. And so I was a little scared to go by myself all the way to Sicily, where I knew I would have more trouble with the language, but I had to go. So I decided to go first to the Amalfi Coast because it was on the way. When I was there at this hostel, I met another woman who was traveling to Sicily. So we paired up. We booked this train to Sicily. I thought it was strange because I knew Sicily was an island. I just assumed we would get off the train at some point and get on a ferry or a boat, and that was part of the train ticket. But this train was the most packed train I've ever been in. It was an overnight train. Not only was there no sleeper cars, there was no seats available. So we were standing the whole night with our bags at our feet. All of a sudden, the train stopped. We heard some noises and we asked people around, and it turned out they took certain cars of the train and they put them on the ferry. We were actually going by train to Sicily. It was amazing. I think they still do that to this day. So if you ever get a chance to take the train to Sicily, do it, but definitely reserve your own seat if you can. I have traveled with my friend who I just met, and we went to visit her family in Taormina. Then we split up and I went to Catania by myself, which is next to the town my grandmother's from, which is called Bronte. I ended up being there on a Saturday night and my plan was to go to Bronte on Sunday. I was really dumb and had no idea that Sunday was the worst day to go to any small town. Not only was it Sunday, it was a Sunday in August, so everything was closed. Most people were probably out of town or at the beach or something. And it was beautiful, but it was deserted. I couldn't talk to anyone. I couldn't find out if anyone knew my grandma or her family. I should have stayed another day or two. So I was staying a few hours away by train. It was really hard to get there, honestly, I think, but I didn't know. I mean, there was no way of really finding things out back then. I mean, I'm pretty impressed with my past self that I even made it all the way down there. I remember having some really good gelato and I had to take the train back because there was only like 2 trains a day. And so I did see the town where my grandmother was from. I got a feel for it a little bit, but I didn't really get to spend time there. So I might go back at some point still because I live here now and I haven't been back to that town yet. So that was my first trip to Italy. I felt like I saw a lot, but at the same time, not enough. When I got back, I had this vague idea that one day I would go back and live there. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I didn't even know at the time that I could qualify for citizenship. The way I found out was also pretty random. It was around 2008, 2009, and I read this book called Emergency by Neil Strauss. I'll link it here if anyone's interested. It's a really good book. Neil Strauss is sort of like an investigative, I don't want to say he's a journalist, but he takes an idea and takes a deep dive into it and writes a book. And so he went into these communities of people in the US that were, I don't know if they called themselves this, but he called them preppers. They were people who were all stockpiling and preparing and kind of rehearsing sometimes for whatever end of the world scenario they were afraid of. So he interviewed and got really involved with all of the people who were in these prepper communities. And some of them were stockpiling a lot of food in their basements, and some were just creating their own self sufficient, live off the grid lifestyle. I was in LA at this time. So this book fascinated me because I realized that if shit really hit the fan and there was some end of the world scenario, I didn't have anything prepped or planned. When he talked to a bunch of really rich people that were in this community, one of them said to him, the best prep you can have is to have a second passport so that you can leave the country. So that's when I learned that you could even have two passports. And I was talking to a friend about this book and I said, it would be really cool to have two passports. And he said, I think you could just get one from Italy. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, isn't your grandmother from there? I think they'll just give it to you. It wasn't that simple, but that's when I started looking into it. And I didn't have a direct plan to move to Italy, but I really got the passport as sort of emergency backup plan, just in case anything really out of the ordinary that could happen that could maybe cause a lot of chaos in the world and cause borders to close and things like that. This was again 2009. We just gone through the big real estate crash. There was a recession happening. And I always had in the back of my mind, well, one day I would like to live in Italy. So even if nothing crazy happens, one day I might want to retire there, or one day I might want to travel in Europe indefinitely and not have to worry about visas. I thought it would be a cool thing to have. And so I started looking into it. And sure enough, I did qualify. I did all the research myself. I gathered the documents, including my grandmother's birth certificate from Sicily. This list would be different for everyone as it's based on your own family's connection to Italy. So my case was pretty simple. So I just had to get original copies of all of these documents, have most of them translated and apostilled, and present them all to the Italian consulate where I lived at the time, which was Los Angeles. It was actually kind of cool to get my grandmother's immigration records from the US. It was a cool way to kind of reconnect with my family history. And even though my grandmother had passed away since then, I think she would have been proud of me. So it took about 3 years from the time that I found out that I could get Italian citizenship to actually getting my Italian passport. I was so excited and so happy to finally have a second citizenship that I proceeded to put it in a drawer and never use it for another 8 years. So I'll be making another video about why I moved to Italy when I did and why I chose Turin. So when that's finished, I will link it here. If you want to know more about me and how my life changed since I moved to Italy, then watch the next video. And until next time, remember, you only get one life, so start living it.